super excited to be joining and teaching on your 150 series. The Psalms are so wonderful for people of faith. They play an incredibly important role in our lives and in the development of our faith and in the development of our prayer. And one of the beautiful things about the Psalms is that if you ever run out of words to pray, which, let's be honest, sometimes we run out of words to pray, you can open up the Psalms and you can pray them. They're a little different, say, from Romans or another book of the Bible, because they are not like a theological treatise, right? They're more, they involve theology, but they're more like what theology looks like when it's lived and theology look like when it's prayed. And the other great thing is that there's a psalm for every occasion. So if you're happy, there's a psalm for that. And if you're sad, there's a psalm for that. And if you're angry, there's a psalm for that. And if you're really, really angry and want to harm your neighbor's child, there's a psalm for that. What kind of book is this? If you're anxious, there's a psalm for that. This is the prayer book of the Christian community. Eugene Peterson puts it like this. He said, the Psalms had always been the primary means by which Christians learned to pray everything they lived and live everything they prayed over the long haul. One of the things that I find interesting about the Psalms is that they're deeply personal, and yet they're written for corporate worship. The psalm that we're going to explore this morning is Psalm 131. It's no exception to that. So it begins really in a very deeply personal way, and then verse 3 is kind of the corporate setting. So my heart is not proud, Lord. My eyes are not haughty. I do not concern myself with great matters or things too wonderful for me. But I have calmed myself and quieted my ambitions. I am like a weaned child with its mother. Like a weaned child, I am content. Israel, put your hope in the Lord both now and forevermore. So you can see here how the psalm addresses the individual, but it's situated within the life of the community. But this psalm actually does that in a particular way. If you were to look at the actual text in your Bible, beneath the 130, you would see that it's written songs of ascent. So there are these 15 psalms, beginning at Psalm 120 and going through Psalm 134. And all 15 of these psalms are called Psalms of Ascent. And what would happen with these Psalms of Ascent is that faithful Hebrews 3 times a year would make a journey toward Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem was the highest point in Palestine. And so they would walk toward, literally ascend, hence songs of ascent. They would literally ascend towards Jerusalem, and they would sing these songs, perhaps in sequence as we have them in the scriptures. They would sing these songs as they would go upward. So you can see that literally they're moving upward, but there's a bit of a metaphor here too, isn't there? So Eugene Peterson again puts it like this. The ascent was not only literal, it was also a metaphor. The trip to Jerusalem acted out a life lived upwards towards God. An existence that advanced from one level to another in developing maturity. So the way that it's supposed to be with us is that the longer that we're on this journey with Jesus, the higher we should be climbing, to further that metaphor, right? And the deeper and the more that we reach these levels of maturity. Particularly, we see this with the Psalms of Ascent. They have something to do with maturity. You're going up levels, right? So the question then becomes, with this Psalm 131, how is it a description of maturity in the act of the believer? So I really love this psalm, which is why I chose to speak on it this morning. And one of the reasons that I love this psalm is that I've often actually prayed it during times of anxiety in my own life. You hit these seasons, right? You hit these things and you become overwhelmed. And on more than one occasion when I've become overwhelmed, I've gone and taken my Bible and just sat with it and prayed these words. I've calmed and quieted my heart. I'm like breathe deeply, Phil. You're going to be okay. I've calmed and quieted my soul like a weaned child with its mother. So I've prayed this numerous times. I've quieted my soul with it numerous times. What's interesting, though, is while it's been really beneficial for me as I've prayed it, upon further reflection, as I look at this psalm and as I studied it this week, it kind of has a different type of stress associated with it than what I normally associate with it. Here's what the text says. I have calmed myself and quieted my ambitions. So the writer, who many scholars believe was a woman, although it says it's assigned to David and no man has ever taken credit for a woman's work before, so that can't be possible. The writer, whoever this was, is not dealing with the types of stresses that I've normally brought to the text. Actually, the writer is dealing with ambition, that we have all these big ambitions. And as I come to think about it, I don't think that I've ever prayed this psalm when I felt overly ambitious. The prayer that I normally pray when I feel ambitious is, God, I have some pretty good plans, so if you could back me up on these and help me out, right? But really, to be honest, I don't normally go to the Psalms at all. Normally, I go to OmniFocus on my computer, and I begin to categorize and contextualize my different to-do lists, all within projects with assigned dates. This is what I do with my ambitions. But while I'm busy doing that and reading James Clear's Atomic Habits, there is this community who faithfully is marching upward toward Jerusalem, toward God, and saying that I have quieted my ambitions. So this is really interesting. Now, because I've spoken here before, and I know that inevitably one of you 5-year, 10-year gold people is going to come up and rebuke me at the end of the service, let me make clear that I'm actually not against ambitions. I'm not against goals. It's just the problem is that these can tend to get in the way really, really quickly of things that matter, right? If I look at what often stands in the way of my prayer life, it's actually ambition. So I'll, get up early and the house is quiet. And in fact, it's so quiet that I think this is a really good time to do the writing of the book that I've put off. So even though I had planned to pray, I have these ambitions for this book, and I've told myself that I want to spend 30 minutes a day, no matter how busy I am doing it. And so that 30 minutes turns into an hour. Everybody's up. I go to work. I don't end up praying that day. My ambitions can take over pretty quickly. So what is it about our ambitions that tend to get in the way and that tempt us by use of lofty plans, even religiously lofty plans, by the way, and even, I will say, church plans, because this whole thing is rooted kind of congregationally, that we suddenly begin to ignore the things that are more important, like family or prayer. We're so ambitious that even at dinner with people we're close to, we can't stop checking the stock market or the likes on our Instagram or Facebook, or for me, who's opened or unsubscribed to my MailChimp thing, right? Why? Why do we do this? And I think that there's an underlying issue here, and it's an issue of identity. Henry Nouwen, I read Nouwen. I always tell people, whenever I get overwhelmed, aside from 131, I read Nouwen. And Nouwen is very famous for saying this, that you are the beloved of God. Do you believe that this morning? Do you believe that this morning? Some of you. You, regardless of how you feel coming in here this morning, are a beloved son or a beloved daughter of God. And this is the truest identity that you have. But Nouwen warns us, he says, the ultimate spiritual temptation is to doubt this fundamental truth about ourselves and trust in alternative identities. Alternative identities. And he lists 3. I am what I do. I am what other people say about me, or I am what I have. Now, the problem with me bringing this up in this room today is that nobody in this room thinks that this applies to them. This is like going to prison and asking who's guilty. Nobody's guilty in prison, right? And here this morning, probably none of us really think that this is how we're finding our identity. But the thing is that these work themselves out usually just beneath the surface of our lives. I think what happens a lot of times, we miss the motivation of what we do, and we just focus on the end goal. My wife has helped me immensely in this. She's an Enneagram coach, and so she helps with motivations. Because a lot of times, all I focus on is the end goal, and I'm not really looking at my own self and what's happening in me. So we'll take this sermon, for example. My end goal this morning is to preach a good sermon. Why is it I want to preach a good sermon? I would say I want to preach a good sermon because I want both you and I to be both challenged and encouraged in our faith. Hopefully I'm preaching this sermon because I want to see the body of Christ built up by the power of the gospel. And so, because I'm pure of heart, those are obviously my motives when I preach. But as I look back over this week, I have to admit that it's a little bit difficult sometimes to preach a 3-verse psalm, and I chose it. But then I started reading other psalms, and some of the things were sticking out to me. I'm like, oh my goodness, I could totally do some crazy historical research on this. Definitely going to be some wow factor. This could be really good. And so I was really tempted to not preach this sermon and to get something a little bit more wow factor-ish. And then the irony of that hit me is I was nervous that I wasn't being ambitious enough and lofty enough with this text, which has to do with not being ambitious and not having too lofty of goals. And do you see how subtly these competing identities work with us, right? They're not normally obvious. They're just beneath the surface. So Henry Nouwen, he had a friend who was a minister, in fact. And his friend wrote to him and said, I'm struggling in the life of faithfulness right now. Like my spiritual life feels dry. I feel like I'm wrestling with faithfulness. He actually talked about how very complex the spiritual life is. And then he said that he felt that his primary work at that point, his greatest chore, as he put it, were to name his demons, to name the things that are getting underneath. And Nouwen had about 2 sentences of niceties, like, hey, so great to hear from you. Hope everybody's well. Let me start by disagreeing with you. I do not think that the life of faithfulness in response to God is a very complex affair. I believe that it is a very simple affair and therefore so very hard. This is interesting. What Nouwen is saying is, we are so used to being ambitious with everything that when we come before God, we try to make it so much harder than it is. And that's why it's hard, because we won't actually accept the simplicity of it. So then, if that were enough, Nouwen goes on, therefore I also enjoy disagreeing with you when you say, naming the demons is the initial and greatest chore. I don't think so. The first and most important task we have is to keep our eyes on God and Him alone. We will never overcome the demons by analyzing them, but only by forgetting them in an all-consuming love for God. And as I actually thought about my wife's work, because she focuses on motivations, but moves into prayer and moves into the disciplines of the all-consuming love of God. Because otherwise, what we end up doing is we get so focused on, particularly those of us who enjoy kind of intellectual endeavors, if I could just analyze the demon, right? Then if I could just analyze these things, then maybe I can figure it out. And what Nouwen is saying, what I think the psalm is saying, is that if you want to go higher, stop analyzing. We will never overcome the demons. Jesus did not analyze demons, He cast them out. We will never overcome the demons by analyzing them, but only by forgetting them in an all-consuming love for God. Do you have an all-consuming love for God? My heart is not proud, Lord. My eyes are not haughty. I do not concern myself with great matters or things too wonderful for me, say these people as they're marching up. But I have calmed myself and quieted my ambitions. I think part of the problem with all of this is actually an issue of control. We feel if we can name the demons, we can control the demons, right? We feel like if we're ambitious enough with our calendar, then we can control the shape of our lives. We feel that if we're ambitious enough with our goals at work, ambitious enough with our family, ambitious enough with our friends, all of these types of things, ambitious enough with our religious work, then we can have some semblance of control and we can shape our lives. I graduated from college and I moved to Grand Rapids, Michigan to work at a church there. And Grand Rapids was an interesting place at that time. So Michael and Lisa Gungor were just up the street. They're like on the Liturgist podcast. There was a preacher that a few people might have heard of called Rob Bell. He was just up the street from us. And Rob came from, he was working with a guy named Ed Dobson. And Ed was a really influential guy in our city. And one of the interesting things with Ed is he just had this massive church. But unfortunately, some years ago, he was diagnosed with Lou Gehrig's ALS disease, which is just a terrible, debilitating disease, and of which there is no cure. Well, he's written a few books. He's since passed, but he's written a few books. And there's a short film series, which you can look up, called Ed's Story. And in one of these, he was talking about Lou Gehrig's, and he said this, early on in my life, I thought I was in control. And ALS taught me I'm not in control. And the truth is, you don't control squat. We think we are in control. We are one unpredictable storm away from realizing how little we control. One call from the doctor, one conversation, and all this illusion of control goes away, right? I mean, Job's life was like this. Oldest book in the Bible. So Job, things are going well for him. He's trying to live well for God, and it seems as if he's being rewarded for this until it seems like he's not being rewarded for this. And it goes on for chapter after chapter after chapter after chapter of Job trying to figure out what on earth is happening. And where is God? And finally, God shows up at the end. And if you'd never read the book before, I would expect God to show up and apologize to Job. And God doesn't. God shows up and basically says, Job, you don't understand how things work. And you never did understand how things worked. There's a biblical scholar by the name of Ellen Davis, and she says this: the great question that God's speech out of the whirlwind poses for Job and every other person of integrity is this: can you love what you do not control? Can you love what you do not control? And here's where the language of weaning comes in this psalm. Do you know that you are never more in control of the world than when you were a newborn baby? Think about this. A newborn baby will tell you, and you will listen, when they're going to eat. They have an unbelievable ability to control your sleep schedule, right? And we look at it and say, all of this is very good because they need to be nourished. But then there comes a point where actually they didn't really want to eat. They just wanted to be with you at 2:37 in the morning. So for all of you new parents with your beautiful, controlling little babies, I want you to know sleep is coming. But I hate to say it, but I think that this is actually how many of us view our relationship with God. And this is the lower level and not the higher level of the relationship with God. Many of us feel, even if we wouldn't express it this way, that the way it's supposed to work with me and God is that when I cry, God hears me and God answers me every single time just the way that I want God to answer me. But the problem with this is who's in control of that relationship? We are, right? We remain the subject and God becomes the object of the relationship. But do you want to go higher with God? Do you want to move on to deeper levels of communion with God? How do we do it? So our pilgrims climbing toward Jerusalem tell us, I have calmed and quieted myself. I have quieted my ambitions. I am like a weaned child with its mother. Like a weaned child, I am content. So the question is, how do you wean a child? A woman should totally be preaching this sermon. Marissa, how do you wean a child? You wean a child through disappointment. Really. Through strategic disappointment. A child is weaned. Suddenly the child does not get his or her way every single time they cry. And this is hard, right? But this is what weaning is. And I think that this psalm is teaching us, it's something about going up to higher levels with God, of learning to be content with God, even when God doesn't answer the way we thought God was going to answer, when we thought God was going to answer. In other words, the psalm is about letting go of control and trusting the trustworthiness of God. This past week, you may have seen it kind of blew up on social media that there's a high-profile songwriter from Hillsong, and he went public with his loss of faith. And his post really had a lot to do with disappointment. So he was disappointed with people. He said, how many ministers are having moral failures? Nobody talks about it. He said, we look for God to do miracles, and I'm just not seeing miracles, and nobody talks about it. So let's be fair. Let's talk about it this morning. The truth is that life is disappointing sometimes. The truth is that life is painful and that we don't always get what we want. And I'm not making light of that because it hurts. But there's something beautiful in the picture of the child who through disappointment has at last learned to lean into the arms of his mother and be content there, right? If your 16-year-old son is still nursing, that is weird, all right? But if your 16-year-old son, if we were to see that boy come home and be absolutely devastated from something in life and fall into the arms of his mother and maybe not have any answers but find peace and contentment there in the midst of life's disappointments, there's something really beautiful about that, isn't there? And I think that this is the secret that these pilgrims would teach us, is that even in disappointment, we need to learn to lean on the everlasting arms of God. And it's interesting because this feels like less to us at first. It feels like less, we want certainty. We want to know how God is going to respond and when God's going to respond. And to not know that seems like less at first until you realize that when the child finally learns to be content, I think they actually go to deeper levels of connection with the mother and not less deep. In 2016, got a call, I think it was on March 15th, from my dad. My dad was in his 60s, pastoring a church out in Nova Scotia. We were living in Atlanta at the time. And Dad had been suffering, we thought, from gallstones. He'd always been healthy, fine. But he was having this pain, having a bit of a hard time. And he went to the doctor, and he called and said, it's not good. I have cancer. And I said, what can they do? And he said, it's not good news, is all he said. And from the day he got diagnosed, I think it was about 5.5 weeks later, my dad died. And it was a painful time. Living in Atlanta, trying to get back. We'd go back a few times, and I remember going to one doctor's appointment, and the doctor, my mom was trying to make Dad some of his favorite meals and stuff so that he could eat, because he'd have one bite of, not even a bite, and just like, I can't do it, I don't feel well. And I remember going to this one doctor's appointment, and my mom said, if I could just know what to feed him, I feel like he'd probably regain some strength and be able to fight better. And the doctor didn't have much of a bedside manner. He said, you could feed him till he threw up. It doesn't matter. Don't worry about it. And that didn't sit too well with me. So Marissa and I went and saw the doctor afterwards, and we wanted to know, how long does he have? He didn't want to know. And then I said, are you telling me my dad's starving to death? He said, no, I wouldn't say starving to death. I'd say he's aging to death. I said, look, you've been gone 1 week. You come back, and you said it yourself earlier in the appointment. He looks like he's aged a decade since you were here a week ago. And this happened over this, 5.5 week process where Dad's in his 60s. He looked well over 100 and thin, and went from, literally in a week's span, one of the nurses came to the house and said, would you like a walker, Mr. Odd? And he said, my aged mother has a walker. Like, are you for real? Come on. He slightly offended, and I was slightly embarrassed. And within a week, he then needed a walker, and then didn't even have the strength to use it. And on one particular visit, it was a crushing visit. We knew it was our last chance of hope, and we went to a doctor in Halifax, and she was so nice and lovely. And we said, what can we do? And she said, there really is nothing that can be done. But you get to say goodbye, and not everybody gets that. So take that opportunity. My wife has lost a brother, and so she was encouraging me, say the things you got to say goodbye. Had a few folks saying this, right? And so I'm a pretty artsy guy, and I'm decent with words. So the way I pictured this going was basically I'd enter a room, and the string quartet behind me would begin to play, and I would deliver this amazing speech, like on the Gilmore Girls or something, right? Like just something really great. And it was not like the movies or TV at all. I bawled, and I couldn't get my words out, and then I couldn't even get my thoughts clear, and everything I said came out wrong. And I'm like, that was honestly like such an awkward moment. That's not how it's supposed to be, right? And so I was a little bit embarrassed about this. So probably a few days later, the Masters was on. My dad loved to watch the Masters. So he's watching the Masters on TV, and I'm sitting next to him, and I just suddenly get overcome with this grief because I know I've got Dad for a few more weeks maybe, and I was trying to be brave for his sake so he could enjoy the Masters, but tears just started rolling down my cheeks, and you get the little shoulder heave, right? Trying to hold it together, and I just couldn't. I was trying, and my dad didn't say a word. He just looked over at me, and he grabbed my hand. And we sat there on the couch holding hands together. And in this moment, everything that I needed to say and couldn't say was said in that moment without the use of words. And I also knew that everything that my dad needed to say to me was said in that moment. There was this deep communication that was happening. Sometimes we ask, I get students ask this question. If God is real and really, like you say, God is pursuing us and wants to be known by us, why doesn't God speak to me? Particularly in my suffering. Like, why doesn't God speak to me the way that you and I are speaking right now over coffee? And I think that what I came to learn from these moments with my dad is that there is a communication that's too deep for words. Words sometimes can cheapen things. And right there in the middle of my pain and in the middle of his pain, what we found was not some great meaning to his illness or Here's the 3 reasons why you're going through this. Everything happens for a reason. We didn't find that, but what we did find is a quieting love. And I learned that even grown men find comfort in the arms of their father. There's a poet by the name of Christian Wyman. And Wyman went through an excruciating form of cancer, may still be going through that. And he once wrote this: there is no clean intellectual coherence. This is at the lower levels of faith, of what we're looking for. Really clear intellectual coherence. There are no abstract ultimate meaning to be found. And he says, if this is not recognized, then the compulsion to find such certainty becomes its own punishment. And this is why they're teaching us, let go. Let go of the lofty, let go of these things. Learn how to sit with God. Otherwise it becomes its own form of punishment. But this realization is not the end of theology, but the beginning of it. And I think that this is precisely the point of the psalm, that to climb up to the next level is to let go of our lofty ambitions and those strange ways of which we're trying to find certainty and trying to find identity aside from being known as the beloved of God. Instead of forgetting these things in an all-consuming love for God, as Nouwen says. To move to the next level of God is, in the midst of pain, in the midst of uncertainty and suffering, to find peace in the everlasting arms of the trustworthy God. Israel, put your hope in the Lord both now and forevermore. Westside Kings, this is our hope, to learn how to dwell in contentment in the arms of God. My prayer for you is that God would take you to new heights. But particularly for those of you who are in this place today and you're walking through suffering and uncertainty and frustration, that you will realize that you are not alone, but you are being held by the arms of the one who calls you his beloved. I pray that you are strengthened for the climb, which is often difficult, but so worth it. And I pray that you find strength and courage and power and life-shaping love in God's arms. Help us, oh God, to let go of our ambition and our striving, even our striving from you or for you, and to rest and settle into your arms that change us. Westside Kings, you are the light of the world. You are a city that's been set on a hill. So go from this place in the knowledge that you are God's beloved, that there is nothing you can do to change that. It is who you are. Rest easy. You don't have to try so hard. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, may God's grace and peace be with you.